Right, so hello and welcome back to Books and Things and welcome to another video, and today I'm here with Nick.
Hello.
And we are going to be talking about The Picture of Dorian Gray. So we have been re-reading / re-listening to The Picture of Dorian Gray over the course of Victober. So I've read this once before, about 6 years ago, and you've read it a couple of times before?
I don't know actually. I certainly read it twice. I'm not sure if I've read it more than twice. This is either my third or fourth reading of it. I don't think I've ever read it physically. I think I've always listened to it.
Really?
Yes.
Interesting. So I read it physically last time and have been listening to it this time. And we listened to the audiobook narrated by Greg Wise.
Greg Wise, yes. I think it was 2009.
Yeah, it's quite an old one now, yeah.
On CD.
And The Picture of Dorian Gray is a really fantastic book. I really love it. It's one of your absolute favourites.
I think having re-listened to it, I can say that it is firmly as my favourite novel again. It was my favourite book when I first read it, and then I haven't read it for 6 years. So obviously just sort of by the natural process of time, it's fallen down the league tables. But having reread it now, I think it's... I don't know whether it's the best book I've ever read. It's certainly the favourite book. My favourite book of the books I have read, I think.
So we thought we would have a chat about The Picture of Dorian Gray today. The Picture of Dorian Gray follows a young man called Dorian Gray. At the very beginning of the book, an artist called Basil paints this portrait of Dorian Gray, which is incredibly beautiful and kind of displays Dorian and all of his beauty and youth. And Dorian makes this kind of wish that he would never get old and that the portrait would get old instead of him. And this wish sort of becomes true. So throughout Dorian's life, as he gets older and more corrupt, it is the portrait which ages and looks more corrupt rather than Dorian himself, and he stays looking young and beautiful and innocent for the rest of his life. And the book kind of follows his relationship with Basil and also a man called Lord Henry, who is one of the potentially corrupting influences on Dorian. And we kind of follow Dorian's life over about 20 years, I would say. But if you haven't read it, I would advise you walk away now, because we're going to be fairly spoilery in our discussion.
Everything. Beginning to end.
All of the spoilers, yeah, but we thought we would, chat about Picture of Dorian Gray, because it is a fantastic book.
So I think actually to start, one of the most interesting things about the book is the preface, actually, which is very short. We've just ascertained.
Just very short.
So I think we'll read it in full, because I think it's actually really interesting. Oscar Wilde's opinions on art and society and all sorts of things are very interesting in their own right.
And it's interesting as well to see how far the book actually does reflect what the preface is saying. It's quite interesting.
I think, reading the book as a conversation with the preface rather than a demonstration of it is really interesting.
It is.
The artist is the creator of beautiful things. To reveal art and conceal the artist is art's aim. The critic is he who can translate into another manner or a new material his impression of beautiful things. The highest, as the lowest form of criticism, is a mode of autobiography. Those who find ugly meanings in beautiful things are corrupt without being charming. This is a fault. Those who find beautiful meanings in beautiful things are the cultivated. For these there is hope. They are the elect, to whom beautiful things mean only beauty. There is no such thing as a moral or an immoral book. Books are well written or badly written. That is all. The 19th century dislike of realism is the rage of Caliban seeing his own face in a glass. The 19th century dislike of romanticism is the rage of Caliban not seeing his own face in a glass. The moral life of man forms part of the subject matter of the artist. But the morality of art consists in the perfect use of an imperfect medium. No artist desires to prove anything. Even things that are true can be proved. No artist has ethical sympathies. An ethical sympathy in an artist is an unpardonable mannerism of style. No artist is ever morbid. The artist can express everything. Thought and language are, to the artist, instruments of an art. Vice and virtue are, to the artist, materials for an art. From the point of view of form, the type of all the arts is the art of music. From the point of view of feeling, the actor's craft is the type. All art is at once surface and symbol. Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril. It is the spectator and not life that art really mirrors. Diversity of opinion about a work of art shows that the work is new, complex and vital. When critics disagree, the artist is in accord with himself. We can forgive a man for making a useful thing, as long as he does not admire it. The only excuse for making a useless thing is that one admires it intensely. All art is quite useless. So we've just looked at our introductions, and they disagree as to when it was first published, but it was first published in a shortened form in a Philadelphia magazine, and then published in a longer form later on.
Yeah.
I believe that the preface was actually added to the longer one, so it doesn't feature in the original book, because the book generated some controversy.
Yes, and I think certainly the things about sort of there is no such thing as an immoral book is perhaps in response to some of the criticism the book received at the time.
I think that in particular is such a fascinating statement, because there is actually an explicit... Well, there is a book in the plot that certain character... Well, Dorian Gray says is immoral.
Yeah, and has given him has sort of badly influenced him.
You poisoned me with a book once, I believe it's what he says in it.
And also, it's a book that is fundamentally about morality. Like, it is a book that is about goodness and sin and about being good or not being good. And to say that there is no such thing as a moral or immoral book when this is a book that deals so strongly with morality is really interesting.
Yes, but what he says in the preface is that morality is the material for the artist. So it's a book about morality, but it's not a book about what is moral and what is not.
Yeah.
Which I think... I think that's true, actually. I don't think the book casts judgment.
I don't know. I don't know if the book casts judgment. I think maybe the book doesn't cast judgment itself, but it certainly does invite the reader to cast judgment.
I think it does. I think it invites the reader to decide what they think, but I don't think the book actually casts... Because if you think about the traditional narrative devices of like casting judgment, you know, like the traditional story format, you know, the evil get their comeuppance.
Yeah, but like, he does.
But he doesn't get his comeuppance. He gives himself his own comeuppance.
I guess so.
If you think about it, like, there's all the stuff with James Vane.
Yes. But Dorian doesn't think he's giving himself his comeuppance. He's trying to destroy the portrait, and he destroys himself because the portrait is himself. So in that sense, like, the portrait destroys him when he destroys the portrait. But I do find the fact that Dorian, as an individual, as a self, is split between the kind of the portrait and his bodily form is something really interesting, because that kind of like doubling is a very common feature in a lot of Victorian Gothic books, and that kind of someone being split into their good parts and their bad parts is quite common. You see it in things
Jekyll
like Dr. Jekyll
and
and Mr. Hyde, and the way that Dorian looks at that as well, there are other Victorian books that deal with that too, is quite interesting. And the fact that his sort of body remains the embodiment of the good that used to be in him, while the portrait takes on all of the bad qualities of him. It's very interesting.
But if you like, he's not actually split between his good side and his bad side.
No, because his body is bad, it just looks good.
He's split between his beautiful side and his ugly side.
That's true, isn't it? Yeah.
Because I know you've talked before about like the Victorian obsession with outward appearance.
Yeah.
Mirroring moral value.
The idea that your outward appearance mirrors your soul is a big Victorian idea.
And this book plays with that in some really interesting ways, because as you said, it does kind of follow that, because the picture gets uglier as he becomes more corrupt.
Yeah.
But actually Dorian, the human who wanders around and does these bad things, remains beautiful, and like people, there's so many people who say, oh, I can't believe all the things they say about you.
When I
because I see you. And actually, I think Oscar Wilde is criticising
that Victorian idea that, oh, well, you look so beautiful and innocent, so of course you are. It's interesting.
I think it is very interesting. Very interesting indeed. So, shall we talk about Basil, Lord Henry and Dorian as because
a trio of characters.
I'm fairly certain, again, it's been a long time since I've actually read anything about the book, but I'm fairly certain that I can't remember. Oscar Wilde. What did he say? Basil Hallward is what I think I am. Lord Henry is what the world thinks of me. Dorian is what I would like to be. And they are the only three characters who are given, I think, full expression in the book.
Yeah, then we might talk about Sybil Vane a bit later.
I think Sybil and James Vane are both quite interesting.
Yeah.
But they're certainly not given a lot of
certainly Basil,
time.
Henry and Dorian are the three main characters.
And we start in Basil's studio. And it's actually Basil and Lord Henry who we are introduced to first rather than Dorian. Discussing Dorian Gray. I think it would be fair to say that the book is as much about Basil and Lord Henry as it is about Dorian.
Yeah, I think so. Although Basil has less, screen time, if you will, than the other two. But I think he's very strongly realised.
He is very strongly realised, and also, although Basil's not there in person, his presence is there.
And also the portrait he painted is there always.
And Basil is discussed quite a lot, even when he's not there.
Like,
Lord Henry and Dorian, well, they make fun of Basil really when he's not there.
Basil is my favourite character.
So
the only nice one.
I think it's really interesting, actually, because I think, reading it this time, I would agree that Basil is the one that you would most like to have to tea.
Of course.
But, well, actually, maybe Lord Henry's the one you'd most like to have to tea.
Well, he would be entertaining, I suppose.
But actually, I think the book is less clearly positive about Basil than I thought it was the first time I read it.
Well, we were discussing yesterday, weren't we, after we finished listening to it, what is the corrupting influence on Dorian? Is it Dorian himself? Is he just, as he gets older, he decides that he wants to be more corrupt? Or is it Lord Henry who corrupts Dorian? Or is it Basil's worship of Dorian and this amazing portrait he paints of Dorian that makes Dorian vain, that makes Dorian so self-obsessed, that makes him more corrupt? And I think you can view kind of all of them as corrupting Dorian. And although, certainly on my first reading of the book, it feels very much like Lord Henry is the one who corrupts Dorian, I think actually you can also see that Basil's devotion of Dorian gives Dorian a much greater sense of his own importance and self-importance. And that is kind of what Dorian is the one. Dorian blames Basil much more than he blames Lord Henry.
I think that's true, actually. I don't think he ever... He blames Lord Henry at one point towards the end of the book. He says, "You poisoned me with a book once." Because Lord Henry sends him a book that is immoral, which is interesting, again, because the preface explicitly says that there's no such thing as an immoral book.
Yeah.
I suppose, actually, it's almost more about how, it is about the interface of perception and reality. And I think, because actually, if you think that the portrait, the fact that it's the portrait and the fact that he doesn't suffer, he doesn't... he's not physically marked by the things he does, which turns him into a monster, because he doesn't feel the retribution, if you like. There's a bit towards the end where he talks about, there's redemption in punishment, and actually you can be forgiven for your sins if you're punished for them. It's quite... Because, Oscar Wilde has quite an interesting relationship with Catholicism, and there is a bit in the book explicitly about how Dorian's fascinated by the Catholic Mass. And it is quite a Catholic conception of morality, the idea of confession and forgiveness and punishment for sin. But if it's the painting that corrupts Dorian, it is Dorian who makes the wish that he can be forever young. But actually, it's Basil as much as Lord Henry who's obsessed with his beauty and his youth. And it's Basil who paints the picture that really, it's the painting of the picture that prompts Dorian to make the, wish. Even if Lord Henry has an influence as well. And Dorian blames Basil far more than he blames Lord Henry.
But also, if we're saying that the two corrupting influences on Dorian's life are the painting that Basil painted and the book that Lord Henry lent him, if the preface says that art cannot be immoral, then those cannot be things that made him immoral, if you see what I mean. So it's very, very interesting.
And I think,
so many layers.
As well, because obviously there is it's a bit on the nose really, but there is a scene just after Dorian's been introduced to Lord Henry, where they go out into the garden while Basil's finishing the painting, and literally in the garden, Lord Henry talks to Dorian about the flowers and the fruit and tempts him. So there is a very explicit framing of Lord Henry as, and I think on a first reading, certainly, I think I would have said it was Lord Henry who is the inciting. He's probably as close as the book comes to an antagonist. except maybe James Vane, I'm not sure. But actually I think it's much more complicated than that.
Yeah.
As Oscar Wilde says, those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril.
And Lord Henry as well is a really interesting character. I think one of the characters at one point says something to him like, you never say a right thing and you never do a wrong thing. Yes. And the impression we get of Henry is that he says all these things and he has all these grand theories of life and pretends great carelessness and indifference to the world and pretends that he only cares for pleasure and so on. But that is not the life that Lord Henry lives. But that is the life that Dorian lives, and Dorian lives the life that Henry does not attempt to realise. It's interesting to note, like, in the second half of the book, when Lord Henry gets divorced, the reason why he gets divorced is because his wife has left him, not because he has left his wife. And that Lord Henry does very little, like, he doesn't actively... He's not a very active character, he just says things, but it's the things that he says which changes the way Dorian acts. As you can say, it's quite interesting. I also reread A Woman of No Importance this month, which is one of his plays, and A Woman of No Importance steals quite a lot of lines, or borrows quite a lot of lines from the Picture of Dorian Gray. The character of Lord Illingworth borrows a lot of Lord Henry's sentences, but Lord Illingworth, unlike Lord Henry, is a much more active character in the way he's behaved, and he does live the things he says more than Lord Henry does, but he says a lot of the same things, which I just think is quite interesting.
Yes.
As a tangent, let's go back to Dorian Gray.
There's a bit very similar to what you just said, I think, in the book, where I think it's Lord Henry says that, like, bad poets are incredibly fun to know because they sort of live the poetry that they can't write.
Yeah.
But the great poets are really boring. It's an interesting analogy to apply to Lord Henry himself, in that he says all of these things and he has all these theories, like you said, but he doesn't actually dare to put them into practice.
Yeah.
And actually, if you look at Lord Henry's actions in the book, and we don't actually see that much of Lord Henry either.
No,
like, he's more present than Basil, but he's actually absent for quite a big chunk of the middle of the book, even if his influence is still there. But he, when Sybil Vane kills herself, he comes to Dorian, and actually, I think that scene is ambiguous, but you can read that as showing genuine concern for Dorian. And I think certainly later on, there's a scene with the Duchess. I forget who the Duchess is. The Duchess, who is sort of rather fond of Dorian and is thinking of doing something unforgivable with him. Scandalous. Yes, that's the word. Doing something scandalous with him. And actually there's a scene where we see Lord Henry talking to the Duchess where he shows quite a lot of concern for her reputation, which is sort of the opposite of what you'd expect Lord Henry to do. Because he makes quite a lot of speeches about women that are not very flattering. I mean, I think it would be fair to say that Lord Henry is a misogynist. Or certainly he expresses very misogynistic ideas. But then actually you do get a sense at the end that he's really devastated that his wife has left him. Quite quiet. I can't really
he says something to Dorian about how Dorian doesn't know all the things that he suffers, which shortly after the mention of his divorce, and I think you can see that. I think it's quite interesting as well the way the book does talk about women and the way gender is dealt with in this book, because Lord Henry is probably quite misogynistic, and Dorian as well is a bit misogynistic too, but I think the book is very much not, and the scene we have with Sybil Vane where she talks to Dorian before she kills herself about love and about her life. I think Sybil Vane, although we don't see much of her, is an incredibly realised character, and the following day Dorian and Henry talk about how Sybil Vane is just like art and she's not a real person. They dismiss her humanity, but we've seen her humanity fully realised the day before, and I think that's done really, really cleverly. And it's interesting too that Dorian and Henry are so obsessed with art, but neither of them are artists, and the two characters in the book who are artists, Basil and Sybil, they are quite dismissive of at various points, even though they pretend to be obsessed with art, but the two real artists in the book they are very dismissive of.
I think Sybil Vane, there's the two scenes, aren't there? There's a scene where we see Sybil on her own with her family. Which introduces an interesting... Because there's a lot of discussion of class in Dorian Gray, even though I don't think it's a book about class in the same way that a lot of Dickens deals with class issues. And but it's
A lot of Oscar Wilde's writing are about the upper class rather than about class in general.
exactly. It's interesting because Lord Henry is always going on about how the lower classes critique the upper classes for their immorality, and actually, I mean, it's kind of borne out. It's legitimate in the book, but that brings a brilliant sort of sense of like Sybil as an actual person, like with her family. I think, like you say, it realises her. And it's really quite well done because it's quite a short scene.
Yeah.
And it's quite a little bit of the book. Like Sybil does not feature in the book very long. But she's probably the fourth most important character.
Yeah.
Arguably, she's actually more important than anyone except Dorian. Depending on how you want to read
Certainly
it.
the fact that James Vane comes back at the end bears out the kind of importance of that early moment with Sybil.
But the interesting thing is that I think her final speech, like when Dorian goes and confronts her after she's not performed well and says, "You've ruined everything, like, how could you do this?" And she says, "But, I'm in love, like, it's not, everything I've acted just feels so...
Yeah, it's ridiculous.
Pointless now, like, the art is irrelevant. This reality is what matters." And it's a really beautiful speech.
It is, yeah.
And Dorian
really
just
powerful.
dismisses it and, says it is over and, like, leaves. But it's very interesting that she understands the importance of reality in the way that Dorian doesn't.
Yeah, it's true. And that there is a separation between art and reality, and the reality matters more than art. Which I think as well is something Basil as an artist also understands. Like, yes, he loves the painting, but he also is very interested in Dorian. He's also very interested in Dorian's kind of actions and behaviour later on in the book.
Yeah.
And I think you can see that the two artists have art in perspective, and the two people who are not artists are obsessed with art and beauty to the loss of everything else.
Yeah, if you like, Basil and to the extent that we get a sense of like her moral compass, Sybil fall much more on a sort of conventional, like there is right and wrong.
Yeah.
And Lord Henry and Dorian subscribe to the preface.
Yeah, there is ugly and there's beautiful, but it's
Exactly.
not right and wrong.
But I think actually, to go back to women, like actually every single woman who actually speaks in the book completely defies everything that's said
they're
about
all
women.
they're all very intelligent and which is not what Lord Henry says.
No.
Basically, I think it's very interesting that lots of his work, like A Woman of No Importance, is very sort of proto-feminist and very angry with society for the way it treats women, but he also does sort of give voice to a lot of misogynistic characters, in part critique, but also the kind of just writing about them.
In a lot of ways, Lord Henry says a lot of awful things, and you can... I know we've already talked about who's actually to blame.
Yeah.
Is it Basil? Is it Henry? Is it actually Dorian himself? Or is it the picture?
Society as a whole.
Or
in the
society,
Victorian period, yeah.
And you can look at them from all sorts of ways. But there are definitely bits in the book where you can see Lord Henry having an influence that's negative. And I think, like I said, in a lot of ways, Lord Henry is the antagonist. And as close as the book comes to framing someone as the antagonist, it's Lord Henry. And I think actually it doesn't do that in the end. But despite the fact that he's clearly an ambiguous character who's not necessarily a force for good in Dorian's life, he is incredibly compelling, actually. I think Lord Henry is the character who has stayed with me the most of all the characters in the book. And it's interesting that I'd forgotten quite a lot, or I didn't remember as well, quite a lot of the later parts, because Lord Henry's in it less. Actually, I think he's compelling. The character we were talking about, who he reminds us most of, actually, is Iago from Othello.
Yeah.
Like Iago, I think Lord Henry is charismatic in a way that makes you not... or makes you willing to overlook, even while you still recognise that he's not necessarily a good character. There's something about him that makes you root for him.
Yeah.
Which I think he's a really, really well-created character. Actually.
Yeah, it's very clever.
Yeah.
And also because I don't think... because you get the sense that Lord Henry says things but doesn't live by them, that therefore seems to make it more forgivable, even though all the things he says have this influence on Dorian. But we also get the impression that he doesn't understand Dorian. He doesn't know what Dorian is capable of. When Dorian says something to him later on, after he's murdered Basil, he says something like to Lord Henry, "What would you say if I was to tell you that I had killed Basil?" And Henry's just like, "Don't be ridiculous, you would never have it in you to kill someone." And you realise how little Lord Henry does understand kind of the being he has created.
Well, I think that's it, because the first half of the book, like, you get this sense of Lord Henry's sort of incredible influence.
Yeah, he's
and
got
how
the power and
he
the
has the
control.
power, and actually at the end of the book, actually he doesn't really understand
No,
Dorian,
not at all.
and he doesn't have the power. And I think that's a really interesting flip.
Yeah.
But I think as well, there's a bit in that same scene where he talks about Dorian's life, and he says, "You've basically had the perfect life."
Yeah.
And actually, to the extent that Lord Henry, and I think there are, like, he is consciously trying to influence Dorian. Like,
Yeah,
there's a
yeah,
bit, it's
definitely.
explicitly said at the beginning of the book. But he thinks he's done the right thing.
Yeah,
Like,
he thinks he's given Dorian this beautiful, amazing, incredible life.
you know, if for him, Dorian is his work of art. Like,
yeah.
Basil paints the picture, but Henry paints the
Yeah,
man.
he makes the man.
Like, I think the other thing that's interesting, just to go back to the painting itself, which is something I didn't pick up on the first time I read it, but struck me as quite interesting, this one. Like, right at the end of the book, Dorian's done something good. Like, he's decided not to run away with a woman and,
Yeah.
you know, cause a scandal with her. Like, he's spared her, as he says.
Yeah.
And he says this to Lord Henry, and Lord Henry's like, "Oh, you just fancied seeing what it felt like you're a hypocrite." You know, just to get you wanted a new sensation. And Dorian rejects it. He's like, "No, that's not true. I did it for more than that.
Yeah.
I did it for better reasons." And then he goes and he thinks, he goes back to his house thinking, "I'm going to be good or whatever it is. I'm going to look at the picture and see that what I've done has changed it."
Yeah.
And it hasn't. And even then he's like, "No, I did do it for the right reason." And then he says, "No, maybe I was just a hypocrite."
Yeah.
But there's a bit there where actually he basically questions, and I think we're invited to question in a way that I hadn't really picked up on the first time. We are invited to question whether the picture is actually a fair representation. Because Dorian says it's his soul, and it shows his sin accurately, but we don't actually know that's true.
So the words, particularly in this bit, are, "For it was an unjust mirror, this mirror of his soul that he was looking at."
An unjust mirror, I think, is a fascinating idea, because maybe the picture is not showing him what he is, but by changing, it is shaping who he is. Because maybe Dorian is evil because the picture tells him he's evil, and he thinks it's true, but maybe it's not true. If you're told by something you think is, like, infallible that you're evil, then maybe retreating into a sort of philosophy of art is all that matters rather than good and evil is a logical and justified response.
And also, if he thinks the portrait is his soul and he sees that his soul is bad, then he makes no attempt to be better because he thinks that's kind of already the writing is on the wall.
Exactly.
This is what his soul is. You know, it's important, I think, that the kind of worst thing he does in the whole of the book, when he kills Basil, is in front of the portrait when he's shown Basil the portrait.
Yeah.
And he hates Basil for having created this portrait
And I
that
think
he feels has had this influence on
he
him.
actually sort of there's even like the portrait almost sort of looks at him like before he kills Basil, I think. But actually maybe that's the message of the book. If you go full circle, is that actually it's in ascribing a moral value to the changes in the portrait and trying to impose morality on art that Dorian goes wrong in trying to draw his morality from a work of art.
Yeah.
So actually it goes full circle back to the preface, doesn't it? So the other element of the book that caused quite a lot of scandal at the time, I think, is it's strongly homoerotic.
I mean, there's not even just really undertones. Like, the first few chapters when Basil talks about, like, the way he worships Dorian is pretty explicit, really. It's very hard, I think, to read that and not think that Basil is in some way in love with Dorian.
And I think there's a strong suggestion that Dorian has a number of male lovers throughout the book.
Yeah, certainly Basil talks to him later about how if any young man that Dorian is friends with is kind of, his reputation ends ruined, which is certainly implies that he's kind of having relationships with these young men.
And I think it's a very Greek idea. I mean, Lord Henry talks at the beginning about a new hedonism, but like it's very Greek. Particularly Lord Henry and in a different way Basil are both slightly older men who lust after a young man.
Yeah.
But that relationship between an older man who's more experienced and a younger man who's sort of in the fresh flower of youth is a very sort of Greek and to a lesser extent Roman, but classical, like, homosexual relationship. Those were accepted and quite common, certainly in literature,
in ancient Greek,
in the classical world. And that is kind of the model that those relationships follow very closely.
And I think we were talking about as well how it's very interesting to look at the different ways Lord Henry and Basil have attraction to Dorian, because Basil is very clearly, I would say, in love with Dorian, but I think you get the impression that Basil would never ever act on that. Whereas I don't think you get quite the same impression from Lord Henry, but I also think Lord Henry is fond of and lusts after Dorian in a way, and he talks a lot about his beauty, but I don't think he is in love with him in the same way.
No.
And possibly Dorian is the only one of the three of them who would ever act on his attraction to men, and we get the impression he's had relationships with men.
It's obvious. Basil nothing ever happens with Basil. I think it's a bit more ambiguous as to what might have happened with
it's
what
true.
might not have happened.
Yeah, I don't know.
I don't think you could ever say for certain that it didn't.
Yeah,
but I think it's not implied that it did.
I think the reason why I think it didn't is because Lord Henry is the only constant companion of Dorian's life, and the implication is that anyone he has a proper romantic relationship with, he ruins. Whereas he never ruins Lord Henry. He does not affect Lord Henry in that way, and I think that's quite interesting to look at. But I think for me that implies that they have a sort of romantic friendship more than anything else. I think you don't. You can read it in different ways. Certainly there is a physical attraction between them, and certainly Lord Henry is physically attracted to Dorian. Talks a lot about how beautiful he is. I think as well the other thing we were talking about the painting and sort of whether it is an unjust mirror is sort of the way. Whether it is actually Victorian society and the strict moral codes of Victorian society that make Dorian what he is, because many of Dorian's sins in the book are things that today are perfectly acceptable: promiscuity and having relationships with men, and promiscuity with both men and women. And I think the way that the portrait judges him as Victorian society would judge him, which leads him to condemn his own actions, which leads him to do actually bad things like killing Basil.
Yes.
And also means that he cannot have the relationships he would wish to have without ruining people's lives, because that is the way Victorian society judges people. Although he is shown to discard people very easily, and he also has relationships with sort of married women and things like that. So certainly I do think it's very hard to say that the things Dorian does are only wrong within the eyes of Victorian society. Definitely some of them are wrong within all eyes, but I think it's very interesting to look at.
Dorian, I think, is said at some point, or maybe a few points in the book, the sort of defining sin is the pursuit of pleasure without restraint.
Yeah,
I think is what,
and without thought to the effects.
I do think it's very interesting to look at the idea of sin, because I don't think the book actually. The portrait judges Dorian, but I don't think the narratorial voice does at any point. Even when he murders Basil, there is no judgment. If you think it was a Dickens book, Dickens would have had something to say about murdering Basil Hallward. And obviously this is a lot later and it's a very different style, but I don't think we are encouraged by the narrator to come to an opinion on as to whether it's right or wrong. We are just shown what happens. Because I think what's fascinating when you talk about the idea of sin in this book as well is obviously Oscar Wilde and homosexuality.
He went to prison for his relationship.
He went to prison for a relationship with a specific man. When it's talking about sin and things that Victorian society won't forgive, particularly that homoerotic element, is obviously something that Wilde must have felt personally very conflicted about, I think. And I think you do get a sense of great conflict. I think the preface is such a strong statement that it invites the reader to question whether it's sincerely held. What's interesting, the whole narrative never judges Dorian, and if you think about the conventional devices of sort of narrative judgment, James Vane is set up as the device of narrative judgment. He is vengeance for Dorian's first sin. For
the sin
betraying Sybil Vane,
that began him on all the rest of his sins. And
yet he's just shot by accident by someone else, and that's it.
Yeah.
And it's actually Dorian himself who ends it because he decides that he can't stand it anymore. So
But he doesn't mean to kill himself. He means to destroy the portrait, not realising that in destroying the portrait he will destroy himself. So I do think it's quite interesting that there is kind of it's a sort of ambiguous ending in that sense.
Yeah.
Does he get his comeuppance, or does he talks about the portrait as his soul a lot. If he attempts to destroy his soul, surely he knows he will destroy himself. So it's quite
it's interesting, and also of course when they find his body, it's transformed,
Yeah.
isn't it, into what the portrait looked like, and the portrait is restored to how it used to be. And obviously it's a classic Gothic horror story in a lot of ways, but also just before that he's been talking about how the punishment forgives the sin. So actually maybe he finds redemption, if you like, by suffering everything that he should have suffered as he went along.
And it's interesting too that the thing that prompts him to destroy the portrait is the fact that it hasn't changed when he tried to be better. Because I couldn't remember the ending well enough, it's been a while since I read it. I thought that he destroyed the portrait after James Vane had tried to kill him, because that's what I remembered as. I'd misremembered it, because he thought that because he kind of remembered his first sin. But actually the thing that leads him to destroy the portrait is not having done something bad, but having done something good and feeling like it hasn't made a difference and he can't do anything about all the badness he's done, which is interesting.
It's a fascinating book.
It really is.
I don't think you'd ever actually be able to say definitively what it's about.
No, it's about too many things, isn't it?
It is about...
in a great way.
It's a work of art that, it's a bit like a painting. You could look at it for hours and find different things in it. And there's themes, a bit like music, there's leitmotifs and themes.
Yeah.
But it just is.
Those who go beneath the surface do so at their peril. Those who read the symbol do so at their peril.
Exactly. I think it's a really brilliant novel. So, I hope you enjoyed our video on the Picture of Dorian Gray. As rambly as it might have been.
I've been filming for about an hour. But yeah, we really love Dorian Gray a lot. Let us know in the comments if you have read Picture of Dorian Gray, if you liked it, what you thought of it, and what your opinions are on all of the many things, and whether you think Dorian is judged, and who you think the most sort of corrupting influence on Dorian is. It'd be interesting to know.
Definitely.
And yeah, I think that's all for now. I hope you're having a good few last 2 days of Victober. And yeah, I'll be back very soon with another bookish video.